The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Air Base as Captain Sarah Hawk Martinez sat in the pilot's briefing room, nursing her third cup of black coffee. At 29, she had already logged over 500 combat hours in her A-10 Thunderbolt, 2, earning a reputation as one of the most skilled close air support pilots in the entire theater. Her call sign Hawk wasn't just about her sharp eyes. It was about her predatory instinct for finding and eliminating threats to American ground forces. The briefing room buzzed with the usual morning chatter. Pilots discussed weather patterns, maintenance reports, and the previous night's poker game. Sarah absently flipped through her mission folder, reviewing standard patrol routes over the relatively quiet sectors of eastern Afghanistan. It was supposed to be a routine day, though. Kind that let you catch up on paperwork and maybe grab a decent meal at the dining facility. That illusion shattered at exactly 0847 hours. Lightning strike. Lightning strike. All available CAS assets to operations immediately. The base-wide announcement system crackled with an urgency that made every pilot's blood run cold. Lightning. Strike was the code for troops in contact American forces under direct enemy fire and in immediate danger of being overrun. Sarah's coffee cup hit the floor, shattering into pieces as she bolted upright. Around her, chairs scraped against concrete as pilots scrambled toward the operations center. Major Tom Bulldog Harrison, the squadron operations officer, was already manning the tactical display when the pilots flooded in. His face was grim, etched with the kind of worry that came from years of sending pilots into harm's way. The large digital map showed a pulsing red dot deep in the Hindu Kush mountains of Kunar province, some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan. "Listen up, people." Bulldog's voice cut through the chaos. "We've got 8 Navy SEALs from SEAL Team 6 pinned down in Grid Square, 847 to 392. They were conducting a high-value target operation on a Taliban commander when the situation went to hell. Intel estimates 50 to 70 enemy fighters had them surrounded in a compound with no viable extraction routes." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she studied the map. The location was a nightmare, a narrow valley surrounded by ridgelines that provided perfect firing positions for enemy forces. Worse, the elevation was over 8,000 feet, making aircraft performance marginal in the thin air. "Current weather over target is deteriorating rapidly," Bulldog continued, highlighting meteorological data on the secondary screen. "We've got a massive storm system moving in from the north. Ceiling is dropping fast, visibility down to less than 2 miles and getting worse. Wind gusts up to 40 knots, with severe turbulence reported." Captain Jake Viper Thompson, Sarah's wingman and closest friend, raised his hand. "What about the other birds? Can the F-16s get in there?" Bulldog shook his head grimly. "Negative. The Fighting Falcons can't operate effectively in that terrain and weather. The mountain peaks extend up to 12,000 feet, and with the storm system, they'd be flying blind. The Apache helicopters tried to get through 20 minutes ago, had to turn back due to severe icing conditions and visibility." Sarah studied the tactical situation with growing dread. The SEALs were trapped in what military strategists called a kill box, surrounded on all sides with enemy forces holding the high ground. Traditional air support couldn't reach them due to the terrain and weather. It was the kind of scenario that ended up being studied in war colleges as examples of impossible tactical situations. "Ma'am," she found herself saying, stepping forward. "Request permission to launch immediately." Bulldog's eyes met hers across the room. They had served together for 2 years, and he knew Sarah's capabilities better than anyone. He also knew the odds of this mission. "Hawk, I won't sugarcoat this. You'd be flying solo into conditions that have already turned back other aircraft. The terrain is unforgiving, the weather is getting worse by the minute, and you'd be facing concentrated Enemy fire with no backup. Sir, with respect, that's what the A-10 was built for, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The Warthog can handle the terrain and weather conditions that stop other aircraft. Those SEALs need close air support, and right now, I'm their only option. The room fell silent as Bulldog considered the request. Everyone knew the statistics close air support missions in mountainous terrain had a significantly higher casualty rate. The combination of hostile weather, challenging terrain, and concentrated enemy fire made it one of the most dangerous missions a pilot could fly. Negative on the solo mission, Bulldog finally said. Sarah's heart sank until he continued. Viper, you'll launch as backup. Stay outside the weather system and provide overwatch. If Hawk gets into trouble, you'll coordinate the rescue effort. Sarah nodded, already mentally shifting into mission mode. She had less than 15 minutes to conduct her pre-flight inspection, review the target area, and launch into conditions that would challenge every skill she had developed over her military career. As she headed toward the door, Bulldog called. Out, Hawk. Those SEALs have families waiting for them to come home, but so do you. Don't take any unnecessary risks. Understood, sir, she replied, but they both knew that in a mission like this, every risk was necessary. Sarah jogged across the tarmac toward her aircraft, her mind already processing the tactical challenges ahead. Her A-10, tail number 8000248, sat ready on the flight line. The twin-engine aircraft looked more like a flying tank than a traditional fighter, exactly what she needed for this mission. Its titanium armor could withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft fire, and the GAU-8 cannon mounted in the nose was legendary for its ability to destroy enemy positions with surgical precision. As she conducted her walk-around inspection, checking control surfaces and weapon systems, Sarah's crew chief, Staff Sergeant Mike Wrench Johnson, approached with her helmet and survival gear. Ma'am, I heard about the mission, Wrench said, his weathered face showing concern. I've loaded you with maximum ordnance full complement of 30mm rounds, mixed high explosive and armor piercing. You've got 4 AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 2 500-pound bombs. Everything's checked and double-checked. Thanks, Wrench. How's the bird running? Like a dream, ma'am. Both engines are purring. All systems green. Just brought her back from a complete inspection yesterday. Should bring you home. Sarah climbed into the cockpit, her hands automatically going through the startup procedures she had performed hundreds of times. But this time was different. This time, 8 of America's finest warriors were counting on her to reach them through conditions that had defeated other aircraft. As the twin engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment and thought about the SEALs trapped in that remote valley. She didn't know their names or faces, but she knew they were fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers. They had volunteered for the most dangerous missions to keep America safe, and now it was her turn to volunteer for a dangerous mission to keep them safe. Tower, this is Hawk requesting immediate departure, direct to target area. Hawk, you're cleared for takeoff. Godspeed. Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of power as her A-10 rolled down the runway. As she lifted off into the darkening sky, she knew that the next few hours would determine whether 8 American heroes would see their families again. The storm clouds loomed ahead like a wall of darkness, but Sarah Martinez had never backed down from a fight in her life. She wasn't about to start now. Sarah's A-10 climbed through the crystal-clear morning air at 18,000 feet, the twin General Electric TF-34 engines humming with steady power. Below her, the brown and tan landscape of Afghanistan stretched endlessly, dotted with ancient riverbeds and villages that had remained unchanged for centuries. For the first 20 minutes of flight, conditions were perfect, the kind of flying weather that made pilots grateful for their chosen profession. But ahead, nature was preparing to unleash hell. The storm system appeared on the horizon like a massive black curtain rising from the earth to touch the heavens. Sarah had seen plenty of weather fronts during her deployment, but this one was different. It wasn't just big, it was angry. Lightning flickered continuously within the dark mass, creating an almost strobing effect that made her eyes water. The meteorological reports hadn't done it justice. This was a supercell thunderstorm system, the kind that spawned tornadoes back in the American Midwest. Bagram Control, this is Hawk. I have visual on the storm system. Estimate entry in 12 minutes, Sarah radioed, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. Roger, Hawk. Be advised, latest weather update shows conditions continuing to deteriorate. Ceiling has dropped to 800 feet over target area, with visibility down to half a mile. Wind gusts now sustained at 50 knots, with severe turbulence reported at all altitudes. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while mentally calculating the challenges ahead. Flying in mountainous terrain required precise navigation and constant altitude awareness. Add severe weather conditions, and the margin for error shrank to virtually nothing. One wrong turn in those peaks could turn her A-10 into a very expensive crater. As she approached the storm wall, Sarah began her descent to 25,000 feet, a maximum altitude that would still allow her to provide effective, close air support while maintaining radio contact with ground forces. The first wisps of cloud began to streak past her canopy, and she felt the initial bumps of turbulence, gentle reminders of the violence waiting inside the storm. Her radio crackled with static and cleared enough for her to hear a transmission. That made her blood run cold. Any station, this is Razor 76. We are troops in contact. Grid 847 to 392, taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We have 3 urgent surgical. Repeat, 3 urgent surgical and running low on ammo. A voice belonged to Chief Petty Officer Marcus Iron Nike Rodriguez, team leader of the trapped SEAL squad. Sarah had never met the man, but she could hear years of combat experience in his controlled desperation. Urgent surgical was military code for critically wounded injuries. That required immediate medical attention, or the soldier would die. Razor 76, this is Hawk inbound your position. Ada 15 minutes. What's your situation? The response came between bursts of automatic weapons fire. Hawk, we've got approximately 60 Taliban fighters surrounding our position. They've got us pinned in a compound with multiple weapon systems, PKM machine guns, RPGs, and at least 2 82mm mortar. We tried to break contact, but they've got every exit covered. Our medic, Petty Officer Johnson, took shrapnel to the chest. He's stable, but needs immediate evacuation. Sarah gritted her teeth as she entered the storm wall. The transition was like driving into a car wash at full speed. One moment she was flying in clear air, the next she was completely engulfed in churning gray clouds that blocked out the sun. The turbulence hit her aircraft like a physical blow, throwing her against her shoulder harnesses with enough force to leave bruises. Rain began hammering her canopy with the intensity of a machine gun, each drop striking with enough force to create spiderweb patterns across the thick acrylic. But it was the lightning that truly tested her nerves. Brilliant white flashes illuminated the cockpit every few seconds, accompanied by thunder so loud it could be felt through the aircraft's structure. Static electricity built up on her flight suit, making her skin crawl with an uncomfortable tingling sensation. Jesus, she muttered, fighting to keep the aircraft level as it bucked and rolled in the violent air currents. The storm was trying to tear her A-10 apart, shaking every bolt and rivet with malicious intensity. Warning lights began flickering on her instrument panel as the electrical systems struggled to cope with the electromagnetic interference from the lightning strikes. Her navigation system began wavering, the GPS signal degraded by the storm's electrical activity. Sarah switched backup navigation, relying on her inertial guidance system and dead reckoning skills that had been drilled into her during countless training flights but never tested under conditions this extreme. Razor 76 Hawk, I'm experiencing navigation difficulties due to weather. Transmit your grid coordinates again and mark your position with colored smoke if you have any. Iron Mike's response was nearly lost in static and the sound of explosions. Hawk, grid 847 to 392, elevation 8,200 feet. No smoke available. Used our last marking rounds 20 minutes ago. We're in a stone compound approximately 200 meters east of a dried riverbed. Be advised, enemy has heavy weapons positioned on the ridgelines to our north and south. Sarah descended through 15,000 feet, entering the most dangerous part of her flight. At this altitude, the mountains extended on all sides like stone daggers, waiting to impale unwary aircraft. She had memorized the terrain maps during her brief, but navigating by memory through a thunderstorm was like performing surgery while blindfolded. The turbulence intensified as she dropped lower, the mountain peaks creating their own weather patterns that combined with the storm to create an aerial nightmare. Her A-10 was thrown upward by violent updrafts, then slammed downward by equally powerful downdrafts. The Gi forces alternately pressed her into her seat and lifted her against her restraints, making it difficult to read her instruments. At 12,000 feet, she broke through the cloud base and caught her first glimpse of the terrain below. The Hindu Kush Mountains stretched in every direction, their peaks shrouded in mist and rain. Deep valleys carved between razor-sharp ridgelines created a maze of stone and shadow that had swallowed armies throughout history. Somewhere in that hostile landscape, 8 American warriors were fighting for their lives. Sarah's radio erupted with the distinctive sound of close-quarters combat, the rapid chatter of M4 carbines, mixed with the deeper roar of enemy AK-47s. Over it all, she could hear Iron Mike's voice maintaining tactical control despite impossible odds. Contact left. Martinez, get that machine gun. Explosions punctuated his commands. Johnson's bleeding through the bandages. We need immediate extraction. Razor 76. Hawk has visual on your general area. Descending to investigate. Stay. Strong down there. As Sarah maneuvered her A-10 through the narrow valley approaches, she began to understand the tactical nightmare facing the SEALs. The compound they occupied sat in the bottom of a bowl-shaped valley, completely dominated by high ground on all sides. Enemy positions were visible as muzzle flashes twinkling from cave entrances and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect cover and concealment. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site with deadly precision. They had allowed the SEALs to penetrate deep into the valley before springing their trap, using the terrain itself as a weapon. Now the Americans were caught in a kill zone with nowhere to run and enemies on every side. Sarah's weather radar showed the storm intensifying rather than moving through the area. She was flying in conditions that would have grounded most aircraft, with visibility dropping to dangerous levels and wind shear that could flip her A-10 like a toy. But 8 men were counting on her, and she had never failed a mission yet. Razor 76, this is Hawk. I'm beginning my attack run. Keep your heads down and mark any targets you can identify. Copy, Hawk. We're glad to hear your voice. Make it count. We don't have long. Sarah descended through 8,500 feet, breaking through the last layer of storm clouds into a world of gray mist and driving rain. The valley spread out below her like an ancient amphitheater of death, its stone walls echoing with the continuous rattle of gunfire. Through her rain-streaked canopy, she could see muzzle flashes sparkling like deadly fireflies across the ridgelines. At least 30 separate positions, all focused on the small stone compound where 8 Americans fought desperately for their lives. Razor 76, Hawk has visual on multiple enemy positions. Beginning reconnaissance pass to identify priority targets, Sarah transmitted, her voice calm despite the chaos she witnessed below. The compound occupied a strategically disastrous position at the bottom of a horseshoe-shaped valley. Ancient stone walls, probably built centuries ago by local farmers, provided the SEALs with minimal cover against an enemy that held every tactical advantage. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in caves and rocky outcroppings that dotted the surrounding slopes like a constellation of death, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the entire valley floor into a killing zone. Sarah banked her A-10 into a wide circle, staying just inside the cloud cover to avoid presenting an easy target while she assessed the situation. Her targeting pod displayed thermal images that revealed the true scope of the tactical nightmare. Below, hotspots indicating enemy fighters were scattered across the ridgelines in a carefully planned defensive arrangement. This wasn't a spontaneous ambush. It was a meticulously prepared trap that had taken hours, possibly days, to set up. "Hawk, this is Iron Mike." Rodriguez's voice crackled through static, punctuated by the distinctive crack of his M4 carbine. "We've got shooters on the North Ridge at approximately 300 meters. Machine gun nest on the South Ridge at 250 meters. And what looks like a mortar team somewhere to our east. They've been dropping 82 millimeters rounds on us for the past hour." "Copy." Razor 76. "I see the positions. What's your ammunition status?" "Down to about 60 rounds per man for primary weapons. Johnson's unconscious from blood loss, and Petty Officer Williams took a round through the shoulder 10 minutes ago. We're running on fumes here, Hawk." Sarah felt her jaw clench as she processed the information. The SEALs were heavily outgunned, pinned down by superior numbers in an indefensible position, with critically wounded teammates and diminishing ammunition. In military terms, they were what strategists called combat ineffective, no longer capable of offensive operations and barely able to defend themselves. She selected her first target, a Taliban machine gun position that had been raking the compound with devastating accuracy. The thermal imaging showed 3 fighters clustered around what appeared to be a Soviet-era PKM machine gun, positioned in a natural rock formation that provided excellent cover and concealment. Razor 76, "I'm engaging the machine gun. Position on the South Ridge. Danger close. Keep your heads down." Sarah rolled her A-10 into a steep dive, the twin engines screaming as she accelerated toward the target. At 4,000 feet, she activated her GAU-8 cannon, and the massive 30mm gun erupted with a sound like the world being torn apart. The 7-barrel rotary cannon fired depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute, each projectile capable of penetrating tank armor. The effect on the machine gun position was devastating and immediate. Rock exploded in clouds of dust and fragments as the cannon shells impacted with surgical precision. The thermal signature of the 3 Taliban fighters vanished in an instant, replaced by the heat bloom of destroyed equipment and scattered debris. But Sarah's attack run had revealed her position to every enemy fighter in the valley. Suddenly, the sky around her, A-10 erupted in a deadly light show. Tracer rounds streaked past her canopy like angry red hornets, some passing so close she could hear them ricocheting off her aircraft's armored hull. Anti-aircraft fire rose from at least a dozen positions, creating a web of death that she had to navigate while maintaining her attack profile. Her aircraft shuddered as several rounds found their mark. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel as hydraulic fluid began streaming from punctured lines. The acrid smell of burning electrical components filled the cockpit, triggering her oxygen mask's emergency filtration system. Hawk taking fire from multiple positions. She radioed, pulling hard to the right to avoid a concentrated barrage from the North Ridge. Aircraft damaged, but still mission capable. The Taliban. Fighters had prepared for air attack, positioning multiple anti-aircraft weapons in concealed positions throughout the valley. Sarah realized she was facing a coordinated defense system rather than scattered insurgents. This level of preparation suggested the involvement of experienced foreign fighters, possibly Chechen or Arab veterans who had learned their tactics, fighting Russian aircraft in other conflicts. "Hawk, you're smoking." Iron Mike's voice carried a note of alarm. "I can see black smoke trailing from your left engine." Sarah checked her engine instruments and confirmed what she feared her. Left turbofan had taken damage and was running rough, producing decreased thrust and excessive heat. The A-10 was legendary for its ability to survive battle damage, but she was still flying a crippled aircraft into intensive anti-aircraft fire. Despite the damage, she maneuvered for a second attack run, this time targeting a mortar position that Iron Mike had identified on the eastern slope. The Taliban crew was in the process of loading another round when Sarah's cannon found them, silencing the indirect fire threat that had been terrorizing the SEALs for the past hour. But for every position she eliminated, it seemed like two more opened fire. The Taliban had clearly learned from previous encounters with American air power, dispersing their forces and using the mountainous terrain to maximum advantage. They would fire a few rounds, then disappear into caves or behind rock formations before she could acquire them as targets. Razor 7.6, I've neutralized the machine gun and mortar positions, but there are still multiple shooters on the ridgelines. How copy? Iron Mike's response was interrupted by a massive explosion that shook the ground and sent debris flying in all directions. RPG impact on the north wall. The bastards are moving closer. Hawk, we can see movement all around. The compound they're setting up for a final assault. Sarah banked hard to the left, bringing her targeting systems to bear on the new threat. Through her magnified optics, she could see Taliban fighters moving down the slopes in small groups, using fire and movement tactics to advance on the compound, while their comrades provided covering fire from the heights. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Despite her successful attacks on key positions, the enemy still held overwhelming numerical superiority and tactical advantage. The SEALs were running out of ammunition, had multiple wounded personnel, and were about to face a coordinated ground assault from multiple directions. Sarah's left engine coughed and belched another cloud of black smoke as she maneuvered for her third attack run. Her fuel gauges showed concerning levels. The damaged engine was consuming fuel at an alarming rate, and the weather conditions were forcing her to use afterburners more frequently than planned. Hawk, we're seeing more movement on all sides. Iron Mike reported, his voice tight with controlled desperation. Looks like they're preparing to rush us from 3 directions simultaneously. We've got maybe 15 minutes of ammunition left at current rate of fire. Sarah gritted her teeth as she lined up another strafing run. 15 minutes wasn't nearly enough time to eliminate all the enemy positions, especially with her aircraft taking damage and fuel running low. She needed to buy the SEALs more time, but the Taliban commander was clearly an experienced tactician who understood that time was on his side. As she dove toward another cluster of enemy fighters, Sarah realized that conventional attacks weren't going to be enough. The Taliban had planned this ambush too well, prepared too thoroughly, and positioned too many fighters in too many concealed positions. She was going to have to take increasingly dangerous risks if she wanted to save the 8 Americans trapped below. The storm continued to rage around her damaged aircraft, lightning illuminating the deadly ballet being performed in the narrow valley. With each pass, the anti-aircraft fire grew more accurate as the enemy gunners adjusted their aim. Sarah knew that her luck wouldn't hold forever eventually. One of those tracer rounds would find something vital. But 8 American heroes were counting on her, and Captain Sarah Martinez had never abandoned a mission in her life. Despite Sarah's devastating attacks on key enemy positions, the tactical situation on the ground continued to deteriorate with terrifying speed. Her targeting pod revealed a nightmare scenario unfolding in real time. Taliban reinforcements were streaming down the mountainsides like water through a broken dam, flowing from hidden positions and concealed routes that intelligence had never identified. "Hawk, this is Iron Mike." Rodriguez's voice carried the strain of a man watching his worst fears materialize. "We've got movement on all quadrants. Count at least 40 additional fighters approaching from the North Canyon, and I can see more coming down the south face. They've got us surrounded with nowhere to go." Sarah banked her damaged A-10 in a wide circle, her left engine continuing to cough black smoke while she assessed the expanding threat. Through her rain-streaked canopy, she could see the methodical precision of the Taliban advance. This wasn't a chaotic assault by undisciplined insurgents. It was a carefully orchestrated military operation executed by fighters who understood modern warfare tactics. The enemy commander had clearly studied American air support procedures and planned accordingly. He had positioned his initial forces to draw in air support, then used hidden reserves to spring a secondary trap. Now, with Sarah's aircraft damaged and operating in deteriorating weather conditions, he was moving to overwhelm the defenders before additional support could arrive. Razor 76, I count approximately 80 enemy fighters now in the operational area, Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the growing dread in her chest. They're using classic Soviet air fire and movement tactics. This is a coordinated assault by experienced combatants. Her observation was confirmed moments later when a new voice crackled over the Taliban. Radio frequency speaking accented English with the cold professionalism of a foreign military advisor. Sarah's language training allowed her to catch fragments of the transmission, tactical callouts, grid coordinates, and timing for what sounded like a synchronized three-pronged attack. Iron Mike, be advised, intercepting enemy communications, suggesting imminent coordinated assault from multiple directions. What's your defensive posture? The response came between bursts of sustained gunfire. We've pulled back to the inner compound about 30 meters square with 4-foot stone walls. Williams is down with a shoulder wound. Johnson's unconscious from blood loss, and Petty Officer Chun took shrapnel to the leg from that last mortar round. We're down to 5 effective fighters with maybe 10 minutes of ammunition at current expenditure rate. Sarah's heart sank as she processed the mathematics of survival. 5 Navy SEALs, regardless of their elite training, could not realistically defend against 80 attackers in an open firefight. The stone walls of their compound might stop rifle rounds, but they provided no protection against RPGs, grenades, or coordinated assault tactics. She dove toward a concentration of enemy fighters advancing along the valley floor, her GAU-8 cannon roaring to life once again. The 30mm depleted uranium rounds chewed up the rocky terrain, sending fragments and dust flying in all directions. Several Taliban fighters disappeared in the maelstrom of destruction, but the survivors immediately took cover and continued their advance using individual bounding techniques. As Sarah pulled up from her attack run, her aircraft shuddered violently. A PKM machine gun positioned in a cave entrance had tracked her flight path perfectly, walking a stream of 7.62 millimeters rounds up her aircraft's belly and into the left engine housing. New warning lights illuminated her instrument panel like a Christmas tree as the damaged turbofan began to vibrate severely. Engine fire warning, left side, she announced, going through emergency procedures while simultaneously evading intense ground fire. Initiating fire suppression system. The halon gas extinguished the flames, but the engine was clearly dying. Sarah could feel the asymmetric thrust trying to yaw the aircraft to the left, forcing her to apply constant right rudder pressure to maintain controlled flight. Her fuel consumption increased dramatically as the remaining engine worked harder to maintain performance. Below, the situation had become critical. Through her targeting pod, Sarah watched in horror as Taliban fighters reached the outer walls of the compound. The distinctive sound of AK-47s mixed with the sharper crack of American M4 carbines in close-quarters combat that indicated the enemy had breached the perimeter. Contact! Contact! They're inside the wire! Iron Mike's voice rose above the chaos of battle. Martinez, take the east wall. Shun, cover the breach on the north side. Explosions echoed through the valley as grenades detonated within the compound itself. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from both sides, converging in the small stone enclosure where the SEALs had made their final stand. The thermal imaging showed the heat signatures of wounded Americans lying motionless while their teammates fought desperately to prevent being overrun. Sarah rolled into another attack run, but the Taliban fighters had learned from her previous passes. As soon as her A-10 appeared over the ridgeline, anti-aircraft fire erupted from dozens of positions simultaneously. The sky filled with tracer rounds, creating a deadly web that she had to navigate while trying to provide close air support without hitting the American positions. Danger close. Danger close. She transmitted, unleashing her cannon on Taliban fighters who were literally climbing over the compound walls. The margin for error was measured in meters. One miscalculation could kill the very men she was trying to save. Her strafing run broke up the immediate assault, but more enemy fighters were already moving to replace the casualties. The Taliban commander was using classic Soviet-era human wave tactics, accepting heavy casualties to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Hawk, we can't hold them. Iron Mike's transmission was nearly drowned out by automatic weapons. Fire. They're coming over the walls from 3 sides. Johnson's hit again, and Martinez is down. Sarah pulled hard to the right, her damaged aircraft protesting as she maneuvered for another attack. But as she lined up for her next strafing run, she realized the horrible truth. No matter how many Taliban fighters she killed, there were always more to take their place. The enemy commander had committed over 100 fighters to this operation, and he was willing to spend their lives like currency to achieve his objective. Her left engine suddenly seized completely, filling the cockpit with acrid smoke and the smell of burning metal. The asymmetric thrust nearly sent her into an uncontrolled roll before she could compensate with rudder and aileron inputs. Now flying. On a single engine in deteriorating weather conditions, her tactical options were rapidly disappearing. Bagram control, this is Hawk, she radioed, her voice tight with controlled desperation. I have critical aircraft damage and am operating on single engine. Request immediate backup and medical evacuation for ground forces. The response was not what she wanted to hear. Hawk, be advised all other aircraft remain grounded due to weather conditions. You are the only asset available to support ground forces. ETA for weather improvement is unknown. Sarah stared at her fuel gauges in disbelief. With one engine dead and the other working overtime, she had maybe 20 minutes of flying time remaining before she would be forced to abandon the SEALs and return to base. Even worse, her ammunition counter showed less than 400 rounds, remaining in her cannon enough for perhaps 2 more effective strafing runs. Iron Mike, what's your status? She called, dreading the response. The answer came in fragments between gunshots. Down to 3 effective fighters. Williams unconscious from blood loss. Ammunition critical. They're massing for another assault. ... Through her targeting pod, Sarah could see the Taliban fighters regrouping for what appeared to be their final attack. They had taken heavy casualties from her strafing runs, but the survivors were now positioned within 50 meters of the compound on all sides. The next assault would likely overrun the remaining defenders through sheer numbers. Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her military career. Protocol demanded that she preserve her aircraft and return to base when faced with critical damage and fuel shortage. But abandoning the SEALs meant watching 8 American heroes die while she flew home to safety. As she circled the valley, in her crippled A-10, watching the Taliban prepare for their final assault, Captain Sarah Martinez realized that following orders and saving lives had become mutually exclusive choices. Sarah's fuel gauge glowed amber, then shifted to red as she completed another circle of the valley. The numbers were unforgiving. 12 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rate, possibly 15 if she flew at minimum power settings. Her crippled A-10 was literally running on fumes while below her, 8 American warriors prepared to make their final stand against impossible odds. "Hawk, this is background control." Major Harrison's voice crackled through her headset with the authority of a direct order. "Your fuel state is critical. RTB immediately." That is not a request, it's a direct command. Sarah stared down at the compound through her rain-streaked canopy. Through the thermal imaging system, she could see the heat signatures of the 3 remaining effective SEALs moving in desperate defensive positions while their wounded teammates lay motionless against the stone walls. Taliban fighters were massing in the shadows less than 30 meters away, preparing for what would undoubtedly be their final, overwhelming assault. "Background control, Razor 76 is still in contact with overwhelming enemy forces," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil raging inside her chest. "Request permission to continue close air support until extraction assets arrive." "Negative, Hawk. Weather conditions have all extraction assets grounded indefinitely. You will RTB immediately before you lose your aircraft and become another casualty we can't afford to extract." The cold mathematics of military logic were undeniable. A damaged A-10 attempting to land at night in a thunderstorm was already a significant risk. Add fuel starvation to the equation, and the probability of a successful landing dropped to nearly zero. If she stayed much longer, she would be forced to attempt an emergency landing in hostile territory, adding her name to the casualty list rather than helping anyone. But below her, Iron Mike Rodriguez was calling in his team's final ammunition. "Count, Hawk, this is Razor 76. His voice carried the weight of a man saying goodbye. "We're down to our last magazine per man. Maybe 60 rounds total between the 3 of us who can still fight. Johnson died from his wounds 2 minutes ago, and Williams is unconscious from blood loss." Sarah felt her heart clench as she processed the information. Petty Officer Johnson, a young medic from Ohio with 2 kids and a wife, who sent him care packages filled with homemade cookies, was dead. She had never met the man, but she had read his personnel file during the flight to the target area. He had volunteered for special operations to pay for his daughter's college education. "Iron Mike, be advised I have critical fuel state," she transmitted, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. "Background control is ordering immediate return to base." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. When Iron Mike finally responded, his voice carried the calm acceptance of a professional warrior who had always known this day might come. "Copy, Hawk. We understand. You've done everything possible and more. When you get back to base, tell our families we did our job. Tell them we held the line." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 8 years of military training and conditioning pressing down on her shoulders. Every regulation, every procedure, every lesson in military discipline demanded that she follow orders and return to base. The loss of an A-10 and its pilot would be a strategic disaster. That served no tactical purpose. But as she opened her eyes and looked down at the small stone compound where 3 Navy SEALs continued fighting against hopeless odds, Captain Sarah Martinez realized that some things mattered more than regulations. Bagram Control, this is Hawk, she transmitted, her voice carrying a resolve that surprised even herself. Request you relay a message to my family. Hawk, you will comply with direct orders and RTB immediately. Sarah reached over and switched off her radio to base command, cutting the stream of increasingly urgent orders. The only voices she wanted to hear now belonged to the men fighting for their lives in the valley below. Iron Mike, this is Hawk. She called on the tactical frequency. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get you out of this. The response was immediate and emotional. Hawk, negative. You'll lose your aircraft and your life. We're already dead men. Don't join us. Iron. Mike, I didn't come all this way just to watch good men die. Now give me targeting information for that final assault. Through her targeting pod, Sarah could see the Taliban fighters beginning their advance. They moved with the confidence of men who knew victory was assured. 3 wounded Americans with minimal ammunition could not possibly stop a coordinated assault by 40 experienced fighters. But they hadn't counted on a damaged A-10 with a pilot who had decided that honor mattered more than survival. Sarah checked her ammunition counter. 347 rounds remaining. Her fuel gauge showed 8 minutes at current consumption. Her left engine was completely dead, and her right engine was running rough with multiple warning lights illuminating her instrument panel. By every rational calculation, she should be heading home. Instead, she rolled into the steepest attack dive of her career. Iron Mike, I see the main assault force massing behind the boulder field to your north. Approximately 30 fighters preparing to advance. Danger close, get your heads down. Hawk, you crazy bastard. Iron Mike's voice carried a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. God bless you. Sarah's GAU-8 cannon erupted in a sustained burst that seemed to last forever. The 30mm rounds chewed through the rocky terrain like an angry monster, sending up geysers of stone and dust that completely obscured the Taliban assault force. Bodies flew the air like rag dolls as the depleted uranium projectiles found their marks with devastating accuracy. But the attack run brought her dangerously close to the ground, and every Taliban fighter in the valley opened fire simultaneously. Tracer rounds filled the sky around her aircraft like a deadly fireworks display. She felt multiple impacts as bullets punched through her fuselage, and new warning lights joined the constellation already illuminating her instrument panel. As she pulled up from the attack, her right engine began to falter. Oil pressure dropped rapidly, while exhaust gas temperature climbed into the red zone. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she had just committed herself to a course of action that would almost certainly end in her death. But as she climbed back to attack altitude, she heard something that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Iron Mike's voice, filled with renewed hope and fighting spirit. They're falling back. The sons of bitches are actually falling back. Hawk. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Sarah smiled grimly as she maneuvered for another attack run. She had bought the SEALs a few more minutes of life, possibly even a chance at survival. Whether she would live to see the outcome remained to be seen, but for the first time since arriving over the valley, the Taliban assault had been stopped. Cold. Now she had to figure out how to keep 3 Navy SEALs alive with a dying aircraft, almost no ammunition, and less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining. Sarah's right engine began to shudder violently as she climbed back to attack altitude, oil pressure dropping towards zero, while metal fragments from damaged turbine blades rattled through the exhaust system like angry wasps. Her fuel gauge showed 4 minutes remaining, not enough to return to base, even if she abandoned the mission immediately. She had crossed the point of no return, and now her only choice was to make those final minutes count. Through her targeting pod, she watched the Taliban forces regrouping after her devastating cannon run. Her attack had broken their initial assault and scattered the fighters behind available cover. But seasoned combatants like these would recover quickly from tactical setbacks. Already, she could see squad leaders moving among their men, reorganizing. For another attack. Iron Mike, what's your ammunition status? Sarah called, banking her crippled A-10 in a wide circle to assess the battlefield. Down to our last 30 rounds per man, Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the controlled desperation of a professional soldier managing an impossible situation. Chun's holding the north wall, Peterson's covering the east approach, and I'm trying to plug holes everywhere else. Williams is still unconscious, and we lost Martinez when they breached the perimeter. Another good man dead. Sarah gritted her teeth as she processed the tactical situation. 3 effective fighters with minimal ammunition against an enemy force. That still numbered at least 60 fighters. The mathematics of survival were getting worse by the minute. Her targeting system identified movement on the Western Ridge. Taliban fighters were positioning what appeared to be a recoilless rifle, a Soviet-era SPG-9 that could punch through the stone walls of the compound like paper. Once that weapon was operational, the SEAL's defensive position would become untenable. But Sarah's ammunition counter showed only 127 rounds remaining in her GAU-8 cannon. At 3,900 rounds per minute, that represented less than 2 seconds of firing time, barely enough for one effective burst. She had to make this shot count, because there wouldn't be another opportunity. Iron Mike, I see heavy weapons being positioned. On the West Ridge? I'm going to take them out, but this is my last effective attack run. Understood, Hawk. Make it count. They're massing for another assault as soon as that recoilless rifle is ready. Sarah studied the target through her magnified optics. The weapon team had chosen their position well, nestled behind a natural rock formation that provided excellent protection from aerial attack. To hit them effectively, she would need to attack from an angle that exposed her aircraft to concentrated fire from every Taliban position in the valley. But as she contemplated the tactical problem, her engine situation deteriorated further. Her right turbofan began producing intermittent flames from its exhaust nozzle, accompanied by violent vibrations that threatened to shake the aircraft apart. Warning lights illuminated every system on her instrument panel as hydraulic fluid sprayed from severed lines, and electrical systems failed one by one. Engine fire warning, right side. She announced to no one in particular, going through emergency procedures while simultaneously planning her final attack. The Halon fire suppression system activated automatically, but she could see that the engine was dying regardless. Her airspeed began to decay as power output dropped toward zero. Sarah realized with stark clarity that she was flying a machine that was literally falling apart around her. Her A-10 had absorbed more battle damage than most aircraft could survive. But even the legendary Warthog had limits. She was now flying on emergency power with backup systems, and those wouldn't last much longer. Through her headset, she heard Iron Mike's voice reporting new enemy movement, multiple squads advancing from the South Canyon. Looks like they're coordinating with the heavy weapons team for a synchronized assault. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they hit us from all sides. 5 minutes. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and saw 3 minutes remaining. The timing couldn't be worse. She would run out of fuel just as the Taliban launched their final attack. Unless she acted immediately, the SEALs would face that assault without any air support whatsoever. She pushed her throttle to maximum power, coaxing every ounce of thrust from her dying engine. The A-10 responded sluggishly, climbing toward attack altitude with all the grace of a wounded bird. But Sarah had identified her target, calculated her approach angle, and accepted the consequences of what she was about to attempt. The Western Ridge position could only be attacked from one direction, a narrow corridor between 2 towering peaks that would funnel her directly into the concentrated fire of every Taliban fighter in the valley. It was a tactical nightmare that violated every principle of close air support operations. No pilot in their right mind would attempt such an attack under these conditions. But Sarah Martinez was no longer operating under normal conditions. She was a wounded warrior, flying a dying machine with nothing left to lose except the lives of 3 Navy SEALs who are depending on her. "Iron Mike, I'm beginning my final attack run," she transmitted, rolling into a steep dive that pointed her aircraft directly toward the heart of the enemy defensive network. "After this pass, I'll be out of ammunition and fuel. You'll be on your own. Copy, Hawk. It's been an honor." As Sarah dove toward the target, the sky around her exploded with tracer fire. Every Taliban fighter in the valley seemed to be shooting at her simultaneously, creating a web of death that no aircraft should be able to survive. Bullets punched through her canopy, spider-webbing the acrylic and filling the cockpit with wind and rain. Her flight controls became increasingly sluggish as hydraulic systems failed one by one. At 500 feet above the ridge, Sarah activated her A-10 for the final time. The massive weapon roared to life, sending 127 rounds of depleted uranium death streaking toward the recoilless rifle position. She watched through her targeting display as the heavy weapon disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris, along with the Taliban crew that had been preparing to destroy the SEALs' defensive position. But the attack run came at a terrible cost. As Sarah pulled up from her dive, her right engine finally surrendered to the accumulated battle damage. The turbofan seized completely, filling the cockpit with acrid smoke and the smell of burning metal. Her A-10 began to fall from the sky like a stone, no longer capable of sustained flight. "Engine failure. Total power loss," Sarah announced, working frantically to restart her dead engines while simultaneously trying to control her aircraft's descent. Her altitude unwound rapidly. 2,000 feet, 1,500 feet, 1,000 feet. The rocky terrain of the valley floor rushed up to meet her with frightening speed. Through her failing radio system, she heard Iron Mike's voice one last time. "Hawk, you magnificent bastard. You got them. The heavy weapons team is down." Sarah smiled grimly as she prepared for what would likely be her final moments. She had accomplished her mission. The SEALs would face the final Taliban assault without the threat of heavy weapons fire. Whether they could survive with their remaining ammunition was now out of her hands. Her altimeter showed 500 feet and decreasing rapidly. With both engines dead and her aircraft falling like a brick, Captain Sarah Martinez faced the stark reality that her war was about to end in a rocky valley halfway around the world from home. Sarah's A-10 plummeted through the storm-torn sky like a wounded eagle, both engines dead, hydraulics failing, and gravity claiming its inevitable victory. At 400 feet above the rocky valley floor, she made a decision that would either save her life or end it spectacularly. She was going to attempt the impossible. Instead of trying to restart her dead engines, she would use her aircraft's remaining kinetic energy for one final, devastating attack that would either break the Taliban assault forever or die trying. "Iron Mike, this is Hawk," she transmitted, through gritted teeth, fighting to control her powerless aircraft as it fell toward the earth. "I'm coming in dead stick for one last run. When you see me hit the deck, that's your signal to break contact and move to the extraction point." "Hawk, negative. You're going to crash. Eject. Eject." But Sarah had already committed to her course of action. Through her fractured canopy, she could see the main Taliban force massing in the narrow defile between two ridgelines, exactly where they thought they were safe from air attack. Over 60 fighters were concentrated in an area no larger than a football field, preparing for their final assault on the battered SEALs. They had made a fatal tactical error. They had forgotten that a falling A-10 Thunderbolt II could still kill. Sarah nosed her aircraft into a nearly vertical dive, using gravity and aerodynamics to accelerate toward terminal velocity. Her airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. 300 knots, 350 knots, 400 knots. The A-10 was never designed to fly this fast, and the airframe began to protest with ominous creaking sounds as structural members bent beyond their design limits. At 200 feet above the ground, traveling at nearly 450 knots, Sarah did something that had never been attempted in the history of military aviation. She armed her remaining Ordnance 2 500-pound Mark 82 bombs that she had been saving for hardened targets, and prepared to manually release them at point-blank range while her aircraft was in an uncontrolled dive. The Taliban fighters in the defile looked up in terror as they realized what was happening. The sound of Sarah's A-10 screaming toward them at maximum velocity was like the voice of an avenging angel, a continuous roar that echoed off the canyon walls and struck fear into the hearts of men who had never known fear. "Allah protect us!" Someone screamed in Pashto, but there was no protection from what was coming. At 100 feet above the ground, Sarah pulled the manual bomb release. 2 500-pound bombs separated from her aircraft's wing pylons and arced toward the concentrated mass of Taliban fighters with mathematical precision. She had less than 3 seconds to pull out of her dive before following her ordnance into the rocky ground. Sarah hauled back on her stick with every ounce of strength in her body, her aircraft's control surfaces responding sluggishly to her inputs. G-forces crushed her into her ejection seat as the A-10's nose slowly began to rise. Her vision grayed at the edges as the blood was forced from her brain by the violent maneuver, but she held consciousness through sheer willpower. The 2 bombs detonated simultaneously in the middle of the Taliban formation with the force of a small earthquake. The explosions created a fireball that rose 200 feet into the air, followed by a massive pressure wave that shattered rocks and sent human bodies flying like leaves in a hurricane. The narrow defile became a cauldron of death and destruction as 1,000 pounds of high explosives vaporized everything within a 100-meter radius. Sarah's A-10 cleared the explosion by less than 50 feet, riding the shock wave like a surfboard on a tsunami. The blast effect lifted her aircraft momentarily, giving her just enough altitude to clear the opposite ridgeline as her powerless Warthog continued its ballistic trajectory toward the valley floor. But the explosion had accomplished something. Beyond mere destruction, it had created a psychological shock that broke the Taliban forces' will to fight. The surviving fighters, scattered and demoralized by the impossible attack they had just witnessed, began fleeing in all directions. Their carefully planned assault dissolved into panic-stricken retreat as men who had fought the Soviets and Americans for decades concluded that they were facing supernatural forces. Jesus Christ! Iron Mike's voice crackled through the radio static. "Hawk, that was the most insane thing I've ever seen. The whole Taliban force is running. They're actually running away." Sarah tried to respond, but her aircraft was now in its final death spiral. With no engine power and her control surfaces barely responding, she was gliding toward an inevitable crash, landing in hostile territory. Her altimeter showed 50 feet and decreasing rapidly as she searched desperately for any piece of flat ground that might allow her to survive the impact. "Iron Mike, I'm going down," she transmitted, her voice calm despite the approaching collision with the rocky terrain. "Tell my parents I love them, and tell them I did my job." "Hawk, negative. I can see a flat area about 200 meters south of your position. You can make it." Sarah looked where Iron Mike was directing her and saw a small patch of relatively level ground, a dried riverbed that just might, allow her to execute a controlled crash landing. It would require perfect timing and more luck than any pilot deserved, but it was her only chance of survival. She lined up her powerless A-10 with the makeshift runway, dropping her landing gear and praying that the dried mud would be soft enough to absorb some of the impact energy. At 20 feet above the ground, traveling at 180 knots, she flared her aircraft for landing and prepared for the most violent arrival of her aviation career. The A-10 hit the dried riverbed with the force of a controlled avalanche. The landing gear collapsed immediately, sending the aircraft skidding across the rocky surface in a shower of sparks and debris. Sarah was thrown against her restraints as the cockpit filled with dust and the sound of tearing metal. Her aircraft spun sideways, rolled once, and finally came to rest against a boulder field with its nose buried in the rocky soil. For a moment, the valley was completely silent except for the sound of settling debris and the distant crackle of fires started by her bomb attack. And Sarah heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her own voice, confirming that she was still alive. "Iron Mike, this is Hawk. I'm down but alive. Aircraft is a total loss, but the pilot is still breathing." The response was immediate and emotional. "Hawk, you magnificent crazy bastard. Stay put. I can see a Chinook helicopter on the horizon. The cavalry is finally coming." Sarah looked through her shattered canopy and saw a CH-47 helicopter approaching through the storm, its twin rotors beating the air like mechanical thunder. Behind it flew two Apache attack helicopters, their missiles and cannons ready to discourage any Taliban fighters who might still have fight left in them. But as Sarah watched the rescue formation approach, she realized that the Taliban threat had effectively ended. Her impossible attack had not only saved the lives of 3 Navy SEALs, it had broken the back of an entire enemy force and created a legend that would be told wherever warriors gathered to share stories of courage under fire. Captain Sarah Martinez had flown her A-10 Thunderbolt II into the pages of military history and somehow lived to tell the tale. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades grew louder as the CH-47 Chinook helicopter descended toward the valley floor, its twin engines straining against the mountain air and storm winds. Sarah remained conscious in her wrecked A-10, watching through her shattered canopy as the massive helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and debris. The sight of that aircraft, with its American flag painted boldly on the fuselage, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hawk, this is Iron Mike." Rodriguez's voice crackled through her damaged radio system. "Extraction team is on the ground. Chun and Peterson are loading Williams into the bird. We're coming for you next." Sarah tried to move but immediately regretted the decision. Pain shot through her left shoulder and ribs, indicating probable fractures from the violent crash landing. Her legs were pinned beneath twisted metal from the collapsed instrument panel, but she could still feel her feet, a good sign that her spine had survived the impact. "Iron Mike, I'm trapped in the cockpit," she transmitted. "Going to need some assistance getting out of this thing." Within minutes, she heard voices approaching. Her aircraft. Through the dust-covered canopy, she could see Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez and another SEAL moving carefully around the wreckage, checking for structural stability before attempting a rescue. Behind them, a Navy corpsman carried a medical kit and portable cutting tools. "Ma'am, this is Petty Officer Chun," a young voice called out. "We're going to get you out of there. Just stay still while we assess the situation." The extraction took 45 minutes of careful work with hydraulic tools to cut through the twisted metal that had trapped Sarah's legs. Throughout the process, she remained conscious and alert, talking with the SEALs about the battle they had just survived. Iron Mike sat beside her damaged aircraft, providing updates on the condition of his team. "Williams is stable, but critical needs surgery within 6 hours, he reported. "Peterson took some shrapnel, but he'll be fine. Chun's got a broken wrist, but won't admit it. As for me, I've got more holes in me than a Swiss cheese, but nothing that won't heal." When they finally freed Sarah from the wreckage, The Cormans. Examination revealed a dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion, but no life-threatening injuries. As they loaded her onto a stretcher for transport to the helicopter, she took one last look at her destroyed A-10 Thunderbolt. 2. The aircraft that had carried her through 8 years of military service was now a twisted mass of titanium and aluminum, its wings torn off, its engines destroyed, and its fuselage crumpled like a discarded soda can. But even in destruction, the Warthog looked defiant, nose buried in Afghan soil, but tail pointed skyward like a final salute to the enemy it had defeated. She was a good bird, Iron Mike said, following Sarah's gaze. Brought you home when any other aircraft would have failed. She brought all of us home, Sarah replied softly. The flight back to Bagram Air Base took 2 hours through continuing storm conditions, but the pilot, a veteran of hundreds of combat missions, delivered his passengers safely despite the challenging weather. Sarah spent the journey talking with the SEALs, learning their stories and understanding the full scope of what they had accomplished in that remote valley. The mission they had been conducting was more significant than she had originally understood. The Taliban commander they had been targeting was a high-value individual responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. Intelligence gathered from his compound would lead to the disruption of an entire terrorist network and save countless American and Afghan lives. Your attack runs didn't just save our lives, Iron Mike explained as military doctors examined his wounds. You helped us complete a mission that's going to make a real difference in this war. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself in the strange position of facing a formal military disciplinary hearing for disobeying direct orders, while simultaneously being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone involved in the proceedings. Major Harrison, her squadron commander, testified on her behalf with the kind of passion rarely seen in military courtrooms. Captain Martinez made a tactical decision under extreme combat conditions that saved the lives of 8 Navy SEALs and contributed to a successful strategic operation. Her actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service. The hearing lasted 3 days and generated significant media attention when details of the mission became public. The story of an Air Force pilot who disobeyed orders to save a trapped SEAL team captured the imagination of the American public and sparked debates about military discipline versus moral courage. In the end, the disciplinary charges were dropped when Iron Mike Rodriguez and his entire team submitted a formal petition requesting clemency for the pilot who had saved their lives. The petition was signed by over 200 special operations personnel who argued that Sarah's actions represented the finest traditions of military brotherhood and should be rewarded, not punished. 6 months after the mission, Sarah stood in the rose garden of the White House on a crisp October morning, wearing her dress blue uniform with the shoulder still slightly stiff from her injuries. President Obama approached the podium with the distinctive blue ribbon and bronze star of the Distinguished Flying Cross, while members of her family watched from the front row with tears of pride streaming down their faces. Captain Sarah Martinez. The president began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of military personnel and media representatives, demonstrated extraordinary heroism and disregard for personal safety, while conducting close air support operations in support of ground forces engaged in combat with an armed enemy. Despite critical aircraft damage and direct orders to return to base, Captain Martinez voluntarily remained in hostile airspace and continued attacking enemy positions until her aircraft was no longer capable of flight. Her actions directly resulted in the successful extraction of 8 Navy SEALs and the completion of a critical strategic mission. As the medal was placed around her neck, Sarah saw Iron Mike Rodriguez standing at attention in the front row of military personnel. He was resplendent in his dress blue uniform, fully recovered from his wounds, and recently promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer. When their eyes met, he snapped off the sharpest salute of his military career. After the ceremony, as cameras flashed and reporters asked their questions, Iron Mike approached Sarah with a small gift wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a piece of twisted metal from her destroyed A-10, fragment of the aircraft that had brought them all home. "I wanted you to have this," he said simply, "to remember the day we learned that angels really do watch over fools and warriors." Sarah smiled as she held the metal fragment, feeling its weight and thinking about the bonds forged in combat that would last forever. "Iron Mike, we didn't need angels that day. We had something better. We had each other." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah looked up at the clear blue sky above Washington, D.C., and thought about the 8 men who had trusted her with their lives in a remote Afghan valley. Some promises, she reflected, were worth any sacrifice to keep. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of jet engines F-16S from Andrews Air Force Base conducting training flights over the nation's capital. The sound made her smile, knowing that somewhere in the vast blue sky, other pilots were preparing to answer the call when their fellow warriors needed them most. The war in Afghanistan would continue for several more years, but the mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains had become the stuff of legend. Story told in pilot-ready rooms and special operations briefings as an example of what could be accomplished when courage, skill, and brotherhood converged at the right moment in history. Captain Sarah Hawk Martinez had earned her place in that legend, and the 8 men whose lives she had saved would carry her story with them for the rest of their days.